people do have digestion problems. But to understand why some people, though, may respond very positively to anger, let's look at some of the other changes that are taking place. Well, if you observe somebody who's getting angry, for example, you'll notice panting, you'll notice their eyes open more widely and the pupils dilate, their facial colour deepens, their voice is louder, their speech is quicker, their movements get faster as well. And these physiological symptoms are almost identical to the symptoms involved in sexual arousal. And so therefore it's not surprising that some people do get hooked upon anger. They find the emotional intensity that accompanies it. They find it exhilarating. They in fact become anger junkies. Whereas for other people, they become more cognizant of the changes in their physiology and what's happening in their intestines and their stomach, and they actually find it unpleasant. So it varies from individual to individual.
Yes, I've come across people who actually boast about their anger, and they tell you, I've got a very short fuse, or I get very angry easily, and they look at you with a sort of challenge in their eyes, and of course it's a form of intimidation.
Well, it is. But it is amazing that when angry people have had a heart attack, and even though they may have boasted about their temper, how motivated they become to change it, and how well they succeed in doing so, when they know that they're 6 times more likely to get a subsequent one if they don't change their temper.
Yes. The mind and the body, of course, are intimately connected. So what are the physical links with anger, behaviour, and our bodies?
Well, because of this close connection between the mind and the body, there are certain physical conditions which actually lower the threshold for anger. And obviously it's sensible for anybody working with people suffering from these conditions to be aware of that increased risk. Not surprisingly, people who suffer from dementia are more likely and find it more easy to get angry for 2 reasons. One is there's the actual change in terms of their brain structure that's happening, which may damage part of the brain, the neocortex perhaps, that helps to inhibit angry responses. Also, of course, they're suffering an increasing inability to control their environment, and that is very arousing and very threatening and makes it more likely that they'll feel angry. And indeed, people suffering from physical illnesses generally are also have an increased frustration level and are more likely to get angry as well. Another trigger for some people is overtiredness. Most parents will be familiar with a small child who can throw a real tantrum and it appears to be maybe behaving out of character, getting so angry. And if the parent is in tune with their child, they often recognize that the child is actually suffering from a lack of sleep. And when the child is encouraged to go down and get a good night's sleep, their personality is transformed the next day. So overtiredness lowers the threshold for angry outbursts.
Hunger too.
Yes, that's one of my own triggers. My wife, Liz, over a 20-year marriage, has spotted that pattern and has learned to assuage it by providing meals regularly.
Well, you can see that in your children as well. Yeah. Very clear.
And again, of course, hormonal changes in some women, say during puberty and premenstruation and the menopause, or even following the birth of the baby, those hormonal changes in some women, again, lower the threshold for arousal and for anger. And indeed, anything that disturbs that link between the mind and the body, for example, craving for an addictive substance such as nicotine or alcohol or caffeine or drugs, again, lowers the threshold for triggering off anger, as indeed does intoxication. Alcohol actually is quite interesting in that it has paradoxical effects. We all know that after we take the first couple of drinks, we start to feeling a greater sense of calmness, relaxation, we have a sense of well-being and a sense of friendship towards those surrounding us. And there's a good physiological reason for that, in that the first couple of drinks of alcohol actually raise the serotonin levels in the brain. But after you take more than a couple of drinks of alcohol, it starts to have the opposite effect, and it starts to lower the serotonin levels in the brain. So people with a lot of alcohol down, it's far easier to trigger off angry outbursts in them. And clearly that's something one would need to be cognizant of if when we're dealing or involved with people who are likely to be drunk, for example. And another trigger, not surprisingly, is sexual frustration. So that somebody who's sexually frustrated finds it easier for them to trigger off an angry response in themselves. Now, whilst that doesn't in any way excuse angry or violent responses because of sexual frustration, but we need to be aware of the increased risk of it in this context. Of course, people may blame their hormones or their alcohol or their sexual frustration for their anger, but we still need to be aware that many people having these conditions, including physical pain, they still are able to control their anger, and they've learned how to control their anger. And that's a responsibility, of course, everybody carries.
This seems to lead, in my mind, to thoughts about the way anger is expressed in films and on television. And in music even. There is a sort of a glamour attached to it, that we shouldn't bottle things up, that we should express our anger and get as angry as possible. And this is the stuff of drama today. I rather think that there's some myths about anger in our society that need exploring and unravelling.
Well, that idea that we should always express our anger is perhaps one of the most destructive ideas ever to be developed, and one of the most damaging ideas in our society. It really got going in the 60s and the 70s, but of course it goes back, in one sense, back to the Freudian idea that we all carry around some kind of a repressed can of energy in our unconscious mind that must somehow be discharged, or otherwise we become neurotic. That's based upon very, very primitive ideas about how biology actually functions. And indeed, the recent research in a number of areas, including how the different parts of the brain fit together, shows very clearly that this primitive idea is basically wrong. We can look at it from a number of viewpoints. For example, from the dream research, we know that the unconscious mind works through pattern matching rather than having a cesspool of repressed energy. It actually works by matching up patterns from our past. And where we have had an emotional experience in our past that may be connected to something we're experiencing today, then we can reactivate that pattern from the past, and it may bias our perception in our life today. But the way to deal effectively with that is to help the person to stand back from both experiences and to be able to see how they differ, and to be able to identify that the past belongs to the past and the present belongs to the present. And it is by focusing on differences rather than by getting more and more caught up into our past and becoming more and more emotional about it that we can actually learn to deal appropriately with our lives. Apart from the new insights coming from anger research, we also, if we just brought common sense to bear, we would see that the therapeutic practices that have been commonly indulged in, such as getting people who are unhappy with their partner in life, for example, to go home and beat a pillow and imagine they're punching their partner, which was still is, in fact, a recommended therapeutic practice. And this somehow is supposed to magically transform this individual from being an angry individual into a loving individual. I mean, can you just imagine it? Here you are, punching the pillow, imagining it's your partner, and then your partner walks into the room and you're expected to turn around and say, "Oh, I love you, darling." I mean, if you were to consider just boxing for a moment, the world boxing champions, prior to engaging in a bout, they are encouraged to be in the ring, are they not? And they're encouraged to punch a bag and to visualize their opponent. Now, if this theory worked, we wouldn't actually see world boxing champions. We'd see world boxing champions hugging each other in the ring and refusing to get aggressive with each other.
I think there's been over 400 research studies that show that getting people to express their anger, in fact, makes the anger worse. It doesn't resolve any problems at all.
No, indeed, because what you're doing is, in fact, is that you're further stimulating the fight-or-flight response, and the arousal levels are increasing.
And the threshold, of course, is changing all the time, making it easier and easier for to express anger.
Indeed.
That's a very destructive process.
It is a destructive process, and the more angry you become, of course, the less able you are to think rationally about the situation that you're involved in, because high emotional arousal is a trance state, and anger itself is a trance state, just as depression is a trance state, or anxiety is a trance state, or sexual arousal is a trance state. And what they all have in common, these trance states, is that we see reality only one-dimensionally. And that's why anger particularly is so dangerous, because when you're angry, you are ready to physically assault somebody, and you can only see your own viewpoint. So this is a horrendously dangerous state.
Yes, you never hear an angry person say, "Oh, yes, you're absolutely right."
No, you don't. But just exploring these myths a little further, Ivan. For example, another myth that at first sight wouldn't strike one as a myth, but nonetheless research bears it out. And it's the idea that talking out your anger is somehow going to make you less angry. And that doesn't necessarily follow at all. Because most conversations where people are angry, the form is that they undergo a rehearsal of their reasons for being angry. So it doesn't actually advance them. And very often when we discuss about why we're angry with our workmates or our partner, with a friend, the conversation is simply that, a rehearsal of our reasons for being angry. So we actually leave the conversation more angry than when we entered it. And that can happen in the therapeutic context as well. I mean, I've known of endless situations where distressed couples, one of them has gone to a counsellor for help with their marriage failing, and the counsellor has encouraged them to get in touch with their angry feelings, to get in touch with their unhappiness, to keep focusing on what is unsatisfactory in the relationship, going right back to the beginning, and encourage the person to become more angry. In the insane expectation that this somehow is going to make this person feel more loving towards their partner. And again, with children, the idea has often been that children should be encouraged to express their anger. The thought being that if they weren't allowed to express their anger, that they might grow up neurotic. But in fact, we now know that angry children grow up to be angry adults, and it's vitally important that children be taught how to express anger constructively.